"Get that boy away from my daughter. Now." That's what Robert Caldwell said to the security guard standing near the entrance of the toy store that December afternoon. His voice low, controlled, but carrying the kind of authority that made grown men move without questioning. He was pointing at a barefoot boy who stood next to Sophie, holding her hand with both of his, gently, as if cradling something fragile that might break if he let go. The entire store went still. Shoppers froze mid-step. A cashier set down a gift bag and stared. 2 employees exchanged a glance but said nothing. The boy didn't move. He simply looked up at Robert with a pair of dark, steady eyes, the kind of eyes that had no business belonging to someone that young. Eyes that seemed to hold a knowledge they shouldn't have carried. And then Sophie, quiet, obedient, 8-year-old Sophie, did something she had never done before. She stepped in front of the boy and said, "Don't touch him, Daddy." Robert's jaw tightened. His hand hovered in the air. For one long second, the richest man in that room had absolutely no idea what to do. 10 minutes later, Robert Caldwell, a man who had built a financial empire from nothing, who had sat across the table from senators and never flinched, was kneeling on the cold floor of that toy store, holding his daughter so tightly that his arms trembled. His face was buried in her hair, and for the first time in years, he was crying in front of strangers. But to understand how a single whisper from a boy who owned nothing shattered everything a man who owned everything believed to be true. We need to go back. And the person best suited to tell this story is someone who saw every detail unfold with her own eyes. My name is Helen. I was 64 years old at the time, and I had been working as the housekeeper at the Caldwell estate for almost 17 years. I was there when Robert married his first wife. I was there the night Sophie was born. I was there when the marriage fell apart and the silence moved into that house like a permanent guest. I saw it all. The victories, the breakdowns, the mornings Robert sat alone in the kitchen before sunrise staring at a cup of coffee he never drank. What I'm about to tell you is something I've carried with me for a long time, not because it's a secret, but because every single time I try to explain what happened in that store, people react the same way. They lean forward, their eyes change, and then they ask me, how is it possible that a child who didn't even have shoes knew something that no one around Sophie, not her father, not her doctors, not even me, had been able to see? Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Get comfortable, because what happened that day changed every single person who was there. Robert Caldwell didn't grow up wealthy. He grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Norfolk, Virginia, with a mother who worked double shifts at a textile factory and a father who disappeared before Robert was old enough to remember his face. There was no inheritance, no family connections, no safety net. Everything Robert built, he built with raw stubbornness and sleepless nights. By 23, he was running a logistics company out of a rented office the size of a closet. By 30, he had contracts in 4 states. By 41, Robert Caldwell's name appeared on Forbes lists, in business journals, and on the lips of people who wanted something from him, which eventually was almost everyone. But there was a version of Robert that the magazines never captured. Behind the tailored suits in the corner offices, there was a father who was terrified. Sophie's mother, Catherine, left when Sophie was 3. No dramatic fight, no scandal. She simply packed a suitcase one evening while Robert was on a conference call, kissed Sophie on the forehead, and walked out the front door without looking back. The divorce papers arrived 2 weeks later. Catherine moved to another state and gradually faded from Sophie's life, like a photograph left in the sun. Robert made himself a promise that night. Sophie would never feel abandoned. She would never lack anything. He would be enough. Father, provider, protector, everything. And on paper, he delivered. Sophie attended the finest private school in Richmond. She had piano lessons, horseback riding, a wardrobe that would be the envy of most adults. Her bedroom was filled with books, dolls, and hand-painted furniture shipped from Europe. Robert spared nothing. But I saw what he refused to see. Sophie was disappearing, not physically. She was right there, sitting at the dinner table, walking through the hallways, standing in the garden. But something behind her eyes had dimmed. She barely spoke during meals. She stopped asking questions, which for a child is one of the most alarming things that can happen. Her teachers described her as well-behaved but unusually withdrawn, a polite way of saying that an 8-year-old girl was carrying something too heavy for her age. Once, while tidying her room, I found a drawing tucked under her pillow. It showed a small house with a garden, nothing like the Caldwell mansion. In front of the house stood 3 stick figures, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all holding hands. She had, written one word at the bottom in crayon: someday. I tried to bring it up with Robert just once. He cut me off before I finished the sentence. Sophie has everything she needs, Helen. She's just introverted. I didn't push. It wasn't my place. But something in my chest told me that whatever was happening inside that little girl couldn't be fixed with piano lessons or European furniture. It was in that silence, in that invisible wound, that December arrived. Robert had promised Sophie they would go Christmas shopping together. It was rare for him to take an entire afternoon away from work, and Sophie had been counting the days on a small calendar she kept on her nightstand. When the morning finally came, she walked downstairs wearing a red coat, her eyes wider and more alive than I had seen in months. I came along, as I always did, to carry bags, to stay close, to watch. The Kai store was in the most upscale shopping center in Richmond. 3 floors of imported toys, glowing displays, and employees dressed like they worked at a jewelry boutique. The kind of place where your welcome depended entirely on how you looked walking through the door. When we entered, Sophie let go of Robert's hand and wandered slowly through the aisles, running her fingers along the edges of boxes as if she were exploring a world she didn't fully belong to. Robert followed a few steps behind, checking his phone between shelves, answering messages with one hand. Everything felt ordinary until Sophie stopped near the back of the store, next to a display of porcelain music boxes, and stood perfectly still, staring through the glass window at someone outside. It was a boy, small, thin, wearing clothes 2 sizes too large and no shoes despite the freezing wind. He stood on the sidewalk, with his face pressed against the glass, watching the music boxes spin with the kind of fascination that only someone who has never owned anything beautiful can feel. And in that moment, while 2 children from opposite ends of the world stared at each other through a sheet of glass, something shifted in the air around that story. Because that barefoot boy on the other side of the window wasn't just a child who was cold. He carried something inside him that no amount of money could purchase. And when he finally walked through that door and opened his mouth to speak, even the most respected doctors in Virginia would be forced to question everything they thought they understood. If you're enjoying this story and want to find out what that boy whispered inside that toy store, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because what happened in the minutes that followed was something no one in that building was ever able to forget. Sophie stood at that window for what felt like an eternity, though it couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. The boy outside didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply held her gaze with a stillness that felt out of place on a child his. Robert hadn't noticed yet. He was 2 aisles behind, negotiating something on the phone. I watched Sophie from across the store and felt a pull in my chest that I still can't fully explain, as though some invisible thread had tightened between those 2 children, and I was close enough to feel it vibrate. The boy's name was Daniel. He was 10 years old. He lived with his grandmother in a converted storage unit behind an auto repair shop on the outskirts of Richmond. His parents had died in a house fire when he was 5, a fire that Daniel survived only because his grandmother had driven across town in the middle of the night after waking from a dream she couldn't explain. She arrived 7 minutes before the roof collapsed. His grandmother, Vera, was a woman built entirely out of prayer and persistence. She sold handmade candles at a folding table near the bus station every afternoon, earning just enough to keep them fed. She never complained. She never asked for help. And every single night she knelt on the concrete floor of that storage unit and prayed. Not for herself, but for names that God placed inside her heart. Daniel never fully understood what his grandmother meant when she told him, "You see what others look past, child. That's not a gift you chose. It's one you were given." But from a very young age, Daniel noticed things. Not supernatural things, nothing dramatic or cinematic. He simply recognized pain. He would look at someone's face in a grocery store and know without being told that they had been crying an hour before. He would watch a child on a playground and sense the ones who were pretending to be happy. It wasn't magic. It was the fluency of someone who had lived inside suffering long enough to recognize its dialect in others. That afternoon, Daniel wasn't at the toy store to look at gifts. He passed by that street every day on his way to help Vera carry her table home. The window display of music boxes was on his route, and sometimes he paused to watch them spin, a small, free moment of beauty in a life that offered very few. But when his eyes met Sophie's through the glass, something different happened. He saw a girl surrounded by everything, standing inside a palace of toys and lights, whose face carried the exact same expression he saw every morning in the cracked mirror of his grandmother's storage unit: loneliness. And it was that recognition, that silent collision between two children who should have had nothing in common, that made Daniel push the glass door open and step inside. The security guard spotted him immediately. A clerk reached for the radio, but Daniel was already moving between the shelves, slipping past a tower of stuffed animals, his bare feet silent against the polished floor. He stopped right next to Sophie. She looked at him without fear, without surprise, as if she had been waiting. And that was when everything Robert Caldwell believed about his daughter, about her health, her silence, her sadness, was about to be torn apart by a single sentence whispered by a boy the world had already decided didn't matter. Daniel looked at Sophie for 3 seconds before he spoke. Not at her coat, not at the toys around her, at her ying somewhere behind. Somewhere. Her eyes, where the thing she carried had been hiding for months. He leaned in close and whispered a single sentence into her ear. Sophie's body went rigid, her lips parted. Her eyes filled with tears so fast it looked like something inside her had finally cracked open. That was the exact moment. Robert turned the corner and saw them. A barefoot stranger, holding his daughter's hand, his daughter, crying. Robert crossed the distance in 4 steps. His voice came out like a blade. "Get that boy away from my daughter, now!" The security guard grabbed Daniel by the arm and started dragging him toward the exit. Daniel didn't resist. He didn't scream. He just kept his eyes locked on Sophie as his bare feet slid across the tile floor. But Sophie, the girl who hadn't raised her voice in months, suddenly shouted, "He knows, Daddy! He knows what's wrong with me!" Robert froze. The guard froze. Every person in that store turned toward the sound of a child's voice breaking under the weight of something no 8-year-old should carry. Robert knelt in front of his daughter. His hands were trembling when he held her face. "What did he say to you, Sophie? What did he say?" The words came out between sobs. "He said, he knows why I can't hear the music anymore. He said something is growing inside my head, and the doctors didn't look in the right place." The floor beneath Robert Caldwell disappeared. I stood 5 feet away, still holding the shopping bags, and felt my entire body go cold. Because for weeks that Robert had dismissed as nothing, Sophie had been telling us that sounds were fading. Music sounded muffled. Voices seemed far away. Robert took her to 2 specialists. The first said it was a minor ear infection. The second prescribed drops and rest. Neither. One ordered deeper imaging. Robert had accepted those answers, because accepting them was easier than considering the alternative. But now, kneeling on the floor of a toy store, staring into his daughter's wet eyes while the words of a homeless child echoed around him, every comfortable answer he had ever accepted shattered at once. He looked toward the exit. Daniel was still there, standing just outside the glass door, barefoot on the frozen sidewalk, watching. Something shifted inside Robert. Not logic, not strategy. Something older and deeper. something he hadn't felt since the night. Catherine left when he knelt beside Sophie's crib and made a promise he was now terrified he had broken. He stood up, walked to the door, pushed it open. The December wind hit his face. Daniel looked up at him without flinching. "How do you know that?" Robert's voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel swallowed hard. "My grandmother. She knows. She always knows." Robert stared at the boy for a long moment. Every instinct built over 20 years of boardrooms and negotiations told him to walk away. That this was nonsense. That a barefoot child couldn't possibly know what trained physicians had missed. But there was Sophie, behind him inside that store, crying the kind of tears that don't come from fear. They come from relief. The relief of finally being seen. And in that fracture between reason and something he couldn't name, Robert Caldwell made a decision that had nothing to do with logic, and everything to do with a father's desperate, wordless prayer that he didn't even know he was praying. "Take me to your grandmother." What none of us understood yet, not Robert, not me, not even Daniel, was that Vera had been waiting for this moment, and what she carried inside her. Story would not only explain everything about Sophie's condition, it would expose a truth so deeply buried that even the finest hospital in Virginia had missed it twice. Daniel led us 6 blocks south, past the shopping district, past the last row of clean sidewalks, into a part of Richmond that Robert Caldwell had never set foot in. The streets narrowed, the buildings sagged, the December wind cut harder here, where there were no heated storefronts to soften it. Robert carried Sophie the entire way. She had stopped crying, but her arms were locked around his neck with a grip that said more than any word could. I walked behind them, watching a billionaire follow a barefoot child through frozen streets, and feeling, with every step, that something far larger than any of us was directing this walk. We stopped behind an auto repair shop. There, tucked between a rusted dumpster and a chain-link fence, sat a converted storage unit with a blue tarp stretched over one corner to stop a leak. A folding table leaned against the wall outside, stacked with handmade candles that no one had bought that day. And sitting on a plastic chair beside the door, wrapped in a coat held together by safety pins, was Vera. She was small, dark-skinned. Her hands were rough and lined with decades of work, but her eyes held that same impossible steadiness I had seen in Daniel's. A calm that didn't come from circumstance. It came from somewhere far deeper. She looked at Daniel first, then at Sophie, then at Robert. And she smiled, gently, knowingly, as if she had been expecting all 4 of us. "You're the father," she said. Not a question. Robert opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Vera stood slowly, walked toward Sophie, and looked at the girl's face the way a jeweler examines a stone, with precision and tenderness at the same time. How long has she been losing sound on the left side? Robert's legs nearly gave out beneath him. "How do you—" 32 years, Vera said quietly. "I spent 32 years as a neurological nurse at St. Mary's pediatric ward. I've seen this more times than I wish I had. The way she tilts her head, the way her left eye squints when there's noise. Your doctors checked her ears. They should have checked her brain. The air around us changed." I watched Robert's face collapse. Not in anger, not in disbelief, but in the raw, gutting realization that he had missed it, that he had taken "she's fine" for an answer, because hearing anything else would have destroyed him. Vera placed a hand on Sophie's cheek. The girl didn't pull away. She leaned into it, the way a child leans into the touch of someone who truly sees them. "I've been praying for this child for 2 months, Vera said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "God put her face in my dreams before I ever saw her in the flesh. I didn't know her name. I didn't know yours. But every night I knelt on that floor and asked him to send her father to me before. It was too late." Robert couldn't speak. His chin trembled. His hands hung at his sides like they belonged to someone who had forgotten how to use them. I pulled out my phone and called Dr. Whitman, the best neurologist in the state, while Robert stood in front of a storage unit undone by a woman the world had overlooked entirely. If this story is reaching something inside you right now, maybe it's because God moves loudest through the people the world refuses to hear. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what the doctors found that night broke every assumption Robert had been holding together, and what Vera did inside that hospital room made even the medical staff fall silent. Room 409 at Richmond General was quiet when we arrived. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest, heavy, expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sophie lay on the hospital bed, looking smaller than ever beneath the white sheets. The monitors beeped in a rhythm that became the only heartbeat in that room. Robert sat beside her, gripping her hand, his tie loosened, his eyes red. He hadn't spoken a full sentence since we left Vera's storage unit. Dr. Whitman returned 40 minutes after the MRI. I knew something was wrong the moment I heard his footsteps in the hallway. Slower than they should have been, heavier, as if each step carried something he didn't want to deliver. He placed the scans against the light panel and pointed to a small, bright shape. Near Sophie's left auditory nerve. There's a growth here. It's small, early stage, but it's pressing against structures that control hearing and balance. That's why she's been losing sound. If we had found this 6 months from now, the surgical options would have been extremely limited. Robert's forehead dropped against Sophie's hand. His shoulders shook once, then again. Then he broke, completely, silently, the way strong men break when they realize that strength was never enough. We found it in time, Dr. Whitman added. Surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. That night, after the doctors left and the hallway lights dimmed, Vera asked for one thing. Let me sit with her. Robert didn't question it. He simply nodded and stepped aside. Vera pulled a chair next to Sophie's bed, took the girl's hand between both of hers, closed her eyes, and began to pray. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was a low, steady murmur, the kind of sound that comes from someone who has spent a lifetime in conversation with God and no longer needs to raise her voice to be heard. Daniel stood by the door, barefoot, still wearing Robert's overcoat draped over his shoulders like a blanket. His eyes were closed too, and then the room changed. I don't know how else to describe it. The temperature didn't shift. The lights didn't flicker. But something moved through that space, invisible, immense, undeniable. A warmth that didn't come from the heating system. A stillness so deep that even the beeping monitors seemed to soften, as if the machines themselves were stepping back to make room for something they couldn't measure. Sophie's face relaxed. The tension she had carried for months, in her jaw, around her eyes, across her small forehead, dissolved. She exhaled once, long and slow, and fell into the deepest sleep I had ever seen a child fall into. Robert watched from the corner. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But his lips were moving, forming words he hadn't spoken in years, words he had abandoned when Catherine left, words that tasted like surrender. He was, praying. When Dr. Whitman returned the next morning for pre-surgical imaging, he placed the new scans beside the ones from the night before. He stared at them for a long time. Then he removed his glasses. Then he called a colleague. Both men stood in silence, pointing at the same region, comparing, rechecking. This doesn't make medical sense, Dr. Whitman finally said, his voice stripped of all professional composure. The growth has reduced by nearly 60% overnight. This rate of regression, it's not in any literature I've studied. Vera was still sitting beside Sophie, her hand resting on the girl's hair. She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up with what she had already seen on her knees. But what unfolded in the weeks that followed, after the tests were repeated and the results confirmed what no medical textbook could justify, revealed something about Vera's past that not even Daniel had ever known. The tests were repeated 3 times over the following weeks. Each scan confirmed what the previous one had shown. The growth had vanished almost entirely, leaving behind nothing but a faint shadow that Dr. Whitman described as clinically insignificant. Sophie never needed surgery. Her hearing returned gradually, like someone slowly turning up the volume on a world that had been fading to silence. But the part of this story that I carry closest, the part that still wakes me up some nights, is what Robert discovered about Vera when he began digging into her past, determined to repay a debt he knew no amount of money could cover. Vera had spent 32 years as a neurological nurse. We already knew that. What we didn't know, what even Daniel had never been told, was why she left. Vera had a daughter, Grace, born with the same type of growth that had been forming inside Sophie's brain. Vera recognized the symptoms early, pushed for the scans, fought the doctors, did everything right. But in Grace's case, the diagnosis came 3 months too late. The growth had reached a place where no surgeon could follow. Grace died at age 11, in the same hospital on the same floor, 2 rooms away from where Sophie had been lying that night. Vera never practiced nursing again. She walked away from medicine, away from the city, away from the life she had built, carrying nothing but a grief so heavy it reshaped her bones. She ended up in that storage unit with Daniel after the fire took everything else. But she never stopped praying. Every night on her knees, she asked God for one thing, not to erase her pain, but to use it, to let the worst thing that had ever happened to her become the reason someone else's child survived. And he did. When Robert learned this, he locked himself in his office for 2 hours. When he came out, his eyes were swollen, and he was holding a document. He had signed over the funds to establish a pediatric diagnostic center, free, accessible, designed for families who couldn't afford the scans that saved Sophie's life. He named it the Grace Foundation. Vera moved into a house on the edge of the Caldwell property. Daniel and Sophie grew up side by side, so close that strangers assumed they were siblings. Robert stepped back from 2 of his companies and spent more time in that small house with Vera than in any boardroom. He once told me, on a winter evening while we watched the children playing in the yard, that Vera had taught him something no business school ever could. She taught me that the most powerful thing a person can do is kneel. And as for me, I retired the following year. But every night before I close my eyes, I do something that an old woman selling candles in the cold taught me without ever meaning to. I pray, not asking for miracles, simply trusting that the answers we need most often arrive through the people we would have walked past without a second glance. Sometimes God doesn't send angels with wings. He sends a barefoot boy with the truth on his lips and a grandmother on her knees with a fire in her heart that no storm in this world managed to put out. And if this story reminded you of a prayer you forgot you once whispered, or of someone who has been quietly praying for you without your knowledge, subscribe to this channel. Because stories like this don't exist just to move you. They exist to remind you that the impossible lies exactly where faith refuses to give up.